afternoon. My name's Sam Grounds. I'm a senior consultant at Turner & Townsend, and I work on a lot of the RISE programs related to government funding for retrofit, one of which is the Warm Homes Local Grant Scheme, which I'm sure you're all familiar with if you are in the call today. So nice to see you all, and hopefully the session today is engaging and really helpful as you approach that final delivery assurance check with the department. So just to kick off with a quick bit of an agenda, so we'll go through a bit of an overview of a delivery assurance check. So what is a delivery assurance check? Why is it beneficial? Why do you have to go through one in order to deliver your program? We'll talk about things you can do to prepare for a DAC, so things you might want to consider as you approach the DAC or as you are planning towards it. We'll talk about kind of how you go through a DAC, what it involves, what you need to expect, and also how we can help as RISE with things like mock DACs and helping you and supporting you towards that. We'll also talk about avoiding common mistakes, things about ensuring compliance, and then we'll finish things up with a summary. So to get started, let's do a bit of an overview of what a delivery assurance check is. So a delivery assurance check is essentially a process that has been designed to ensure that your project or your program is progressing as it's planned and can meet agreed upon quality, budget, timeline requirements and things like that. So the delivery assurance check is conducted by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero for all local grant projects. And it's basically final stage before you can move into delivery. So the typical DAC process, or what you can expect from it, is that there will be kind of a review of key documents. So we'll look at things like delivery forecast plans, we'll evaluate your progress towards delivery. So we'll think about things like the contractor procurement, we'll think about fraud, your fraud risk assessments and management plans, which I'm sure all of you will be familiar with if you're going down this route of funding. There'll be some quality assurance, so just to double check things like your contractors are in place or they're in a position to start delivering when you'd like to, and then things like stakeholders, so who's involved in your project, who is there to deliver it, how are you managing things like residents, for example, or homeowners. So there are a number of different benefits for a DAC or a mock DAC, and those are kind of as follows. So as I said, we're thinking about things like how to mitigate against risks. So what are some of the key risks? What are some of those risk pillars? What have you got in place to control them? So it's maybe about an early identification of issues within your retrofit program, allowing for those proactive measures to come through and to understand any risks towards your project. But also think about quality assurance, so regular checks. It's a way for the department to kind of double check that you're on the right track and that you are moving towards everything being in place to ensure an effective and timely delivery. Think about things like cost efficiency, so you can catch early issues, thinking about scaling up programs, thinking about delivery, thinking about your expenditure. We can think about as well communication. So, how are you engaging with residents? What is your timeline for engaging with residents? What are you doing to bring them into the project when you're anticipating they get brought into the project? How are you going to ensure that they're engaged throughout and that they're informed about what's going to be happening in their homes? It's a way to enhance accountability, so we can really get an idea of your progress, we can track it, and we can start to identify any of those issues early, flag them so that you can deal with them before you move into delivery. And all of that is kind of really helpful in increasing confidence. If you can identify what those potential issues or blockers are before you actually move into delivery, it's about trying to find ways to smooth those things out and give you a little bit more time to make sure that everything is in place. And this process allows for continuous improvement. So it will also flag things that you need to be aware of throughout. Things like monitoring your fraud risk or constantly updating it and reviewing it, having people in place to do so, and basically double checking this is what we need to be continuously doing to make sure that our project is timely, it's cost effective, and it is going to plan. So that is kind of the things that the department will be checking, and we'll go into a bit more detail about how it actually goes and what happens. But first I want to talk a little bit about what you might be thinking about in preparing for your delivery assurance check. And these aren't things that everybody has to do, but these are just some kind of guiders, some tips for what you can think about as you start to progress towards that DAC stage and what's going to help you prepare a really good delivery assurance check. So the first one is about defining your objectives and your scope. So, you can clearly outline and define and plan for the sorts of things that you want to discuss or that you want to flag as part of your project. So do you have particularly good fraud management plans in place? Do you have particularly good fraud risk assessment? You've got really good engagement with residents. It's about identifying some of the really good things and what are going to be those indicators that makes your retrofit project feasible, what makes it deliverable, and what makes it effective. But it's also about defining some of those weaknesses. So where do we not quite have the things in place that we might need, and that maybe the department will ask us about or that we'll be required to provide. So if you can understand what the scope is, what the strengths and weaknesses are, it's going to help you identify those areas that you maybe need some support on, that you need to bolster before you get to that stage. The second is about collating the relevant documentation. So lots of you, if you're on the local grant route, will be familiar with the MMR process. So that is the mid-mobilization review. So defining scope, understanding the good parts and maybe some of the weaknesses of your project, and then being able to address those before you go to the DAC. So everything is all kind of lined up for you to be successful at the DAC stage and move into delivering your project. So the second bit is about collating the required documentation. So as I mentioned before, you are required to go through the MMR process, which is the mid-mobilization review. Some of you may have already been through it. Some of you may be planning or preparing for it. So the documentation that's required is going to be the same stuff that we are reviewing at the mid-mobilization review stage. So that is your fraud risk assessment, your fraud management plan, and your DAC form. And if you have any things like proof of contract with contractors or delivery partners or whoever it is that's part of your program. So at the MMR stage, if you are familiar with it, you will have submitted that already, and RISE will be providing feedback for you about how you can improve some of those documents. And that is all about preparing you for that final delivery assurance check. So the same documents are going to be required at the final DAC with the departments. That's the last step. So it's about this collating documentation is a recommendation to understand what your feedback has been from the MMR stage. Give yourself, as an organization, give yourselves time and capacity to action some of those recommendations to make sure that the documents are of the highest quality that you can get, and then bringing that all together and having those all ready so that you can then move and contact the department to book your final DAC, and then you can submit those documents. We also would recommend reviewing progress. So it's good practice to be conducting internal reviews of the current project status. So understanding where you are and where you need to get to in order to be ready to sit your DAC. So you might be thinking about trying to identify areas of concern or potential risks that need to be addressed. Where in your project might there be threats to success? What kind of blockers might you experience? Potentially you've had a reduction in funding, and so you're maybe working around that. So it's also about reviewing progress in terms of where you need to be and how reactive you're being to some of those recommendations that you've got from the MMR, but it's also about where your project is at in terms of reaching delivery. And it's also about thinking about, do we have the right resource? Do we have the right team in place? Have they got the appropriate skills and experience needed? And a lot of it is also going to be about lessons learned. I know not everybody has gone through Hug 2. Some of you have. So it's also about trying to consider things like lessons learned, what went well, what didn't go so well delivering Hug, and maybe what has been put in place since then to ensure that delivery is a bit smoother. And at this stage, you can really work on those RISE recommendations and make sure that your documents are progressing in the right direction. Next is to check compliance. So we can do just quick, easy checks to ensure that all your activities comply with organizational policies if they're internal, also industry standards and contractual obligations. So if you have anything in contracts with delivery partners or measure installers or something like that, double checking that these contractual obligations are in place. It's all aligned with regulatory standards. Maybe it's about Trustmark, it's about PAS. And there's general checks like that just if you get to the DAC stage, you want to be sure that your contractors are in a position to start delivering and that they are compliant with everything they need to be compliant with. So just about good management and good planning. You can also think about preparing stakeholders. So you can inform your relevant stakeholders about the upcoming check. And when it comes to stakeholders, I'm not talking about stakeholders like residents. I'm more talking about those internal stakeholders. So you might want to let your fraud team, your internal fraud team, know that the DAC is coming up, that we might have questions about this, or this maybe needs to be reviewed in advance of the delivery assurance check. It also might involve talking to your contractors or your delivery partners if you would like them to be a part of your delivery assurance check, which you may want to. And I think generally it's advised that they are, because they will be in a good position to answer questions about delivery forecast, about their compliance, for example, and everything like that. So we want to let all of our stakeholders around the project know that the delivery assurance check is coming up, and that is also a good way to make sure that everything that needs to be in place can be prepared. We can conduct some pre-check assessments. So again, it's thinking about issues that might arise during the official check. Again, it's about those areas of weaknesses that you might be questioned further on, and it's about trying to address these proactively to get yourself ready for that final delivery assurance check. Is your data correct? Do you have the right resource in place? Have you circulated the scope of your project to the team? Is everybody aligned? Does everybody know what's expected of them and what their role is in the project? And it's an identification really of risks around fraud, around anything else, around delivery. Conduct those pre-checks and assess how ready you think you are. The next one is about creating a checklist. So develop that checklist of items that you want to be reviewed during the delivery assurance check. It's again about noting down those weaknesses, those areas that you think are strengths, and making sure that everything you might be asked about is written down and you have it all there so that you can plan for how you're going to talk about it. You can plan for things that might come up, and you can start to see links between the different elements of your project. This just ensures that you have a bit of clarity. You can kind of further review things, you can make notes, and you can just make sure everything that you want to be reviewed is there, it's prepared, and it's all written down and in front of you. Organise meetings. I think this is quite similar to prepare stakeholders, and it's possibly quite closely linked to that. So scheduling meetings with those key team members and stakeholders to discuss the delivery assurance check. You can set expectations. You can provide examples of things that you might be asked on, and then you can engage your teams to make sure that everything that they're responsible for is in place. It's important as well to understand everybody's roles and responsibilities to make sure they're all aware of it. Because as you know, if you've looked at the DAC form, you're asked about things like project resourcing. So you need to have, full-time employees looking at data, looking at reporting, looking at project management. It's worth engaging with the people you have put in those positions to make sure they're comfortable, to make sure they understand it, and also give them a chance to raise any risks or any issues that they potentially see going forward, because that is going to inform your responses at the delivery assurance check, and it's going to ensure that you are as ready as possible. And then finally, about making sure that you have prepared all of your evidence to demonstrate that the project is on track. So this might be things like, again, the documentation, so the fraud risk assessments and things like that, but it's also about evidencing that you have contractors on board. It's about making sure that you know when your contract is starting, you know when they're finishing, and that you are confident that they can deliver for the duration of your project. So what kind of things are going to highlight that your application is ready, that your project is ready, and that you've got everything in place to start delivering? Because if you can provide that evidence, that is going to really strengthen your performance at the delivery assurance check. So the next section is about using a DAC. So as I mentioned, some of the forms and the documents that you will be submitting, one of which is the fraud risk assessment and one of which is the fraud management plan. But the third is the DAC form. Now, again, if you've been through the MMR or you're planning to go through the MMR, you will be aware that these are the three key documents that we're looking for. So you obviously have your fraud documents, but then you have your DAC form. This is available on the Gov.uk website for the Warm Homes local grant page, so you'll be able to find it. It's a big Excel spreadsheet split into, I think, 6 sections, and this is what you will need to download and complete and then submit, both for the MMR but also for the final delivery assurance check. So you have a few tabs along the bottom. You have a guidance document which basically takes you through the process, and it gives you a bit of information, things you need to look out for, things that need to be filled in, and a bit of an explanation. So if you're unsure, it's good practice to just have a look at the guidance and double check you know what you're doing and where you're going from there. Then the next one is the actual DAC form. So this is one that's split into the sections, and it'll ask you about details about your contract procurement. It will ask you about your delivery forecast table. So, kind of pipelines of properties, a number of trust mark lodgements per month, and a projection of that throughout the whole project. And then it will also ask things about like escalation contacts. It'll ask you about your eligibility verification approach, so those different pathways. And then that is for you to fill out. All the sections need to be completed. And this is what gets reviewed at the final delivery assurance check alongside those fraud documents. So this will all be checked, and they will also refer back to kind of your expression of interest page and things like that. And then finally, what we have is a mock DAC that Rise offer, and I think that's going to be my next slide. And the mock DAC is exactly as it says on the tin, really. It is a practice run for the final delivery assurance check. So the final delivery assurance check is conducted by the department. So as a grant recipient from a local authority, you will sit the final delivery assurance check with the department. You will submit your documents to them, minimum of 5 working days before the DAC date. And then you will sit and interview with them where they will ask you questions and talk to you about your application and your DAC form and your fraud documents. As a practice run, Rise can offer a mock DAC as part of the support service. So we essentially run that in a very similar way to how the department will run their final DAC, where you submit your documents to us, and then we can arrange an interview date for you, which is a conversation between us and you, where we basically ask you more in-depth questions about your application and about the different sections. So for example, if we can see in your delivery forecast table, maybe the number of lodgements that you're planning each month doesn't quite align, and we notice that when we're reviewing the documents, that might be something that we will flag to you in an interview, and we will ask you to talk us through it. So this is just a practice to give you a bit of a chance to see what the interview might be like, and to just get a sense of it and have a practice. And then the idea is that you can then go away again and you can give yourself that period of time between the mock DAC and your final DAC to improve any documents or anything that's been flagged as maybe you have a weakness or you're not quite clear or you maybe haven't got a response ready. You can then find yourself time to go away, make those improvements, do all those checks, and then that will hopefully make you feel more prepared for the final delivery assurance check with the department. So this is part of our bespoke service where we can do a simulated DAC to assess your maturity for the real one, and we can give you some helpful feedback and pointers. So it is a kind of authentic, it feels authentic. We'll be asking you lots of questions about the actual DAC approach with the department, and then we can work to help you identify some risks or any issues or weaknesses. So you can talk to your delivery support manager about doing a mock DAC. And then at the bottom, I've just got a bit of a timeline just to kind of be clear about how this might impact your final delivery assurance check. So as I've kind of been speaking about throughout, we start with the MMR. So that's kind of the first step that all the local authorities will need to go through. That is when we will do a review of your documents, we'll provide feedback. So you then need to give yourself some time to review those recommendations and action them, so improve those documents and make the changes that are recommended. At that point, if you want to, the mock DAC is completely optional. The MMR is mandatory and so is the DAC, but the mock DAC is optional. Now, if you feel as though you've made lots of changes and you would like to have your documents reviewed again and have a practice for the interview, you can do the mock DAC. You can book that or ask your delivery support manager about that. But essentially, we'll review the documents and we'll do the interview. And similar to the MMR, after the mock DAC, you will then need to give yourself some time to make any of those amendments or action some of the recommendations we make, and also identify areas in the interview that maybe you felt you weren't as confident with, and then you can work to address those before you then can sit your final DAC. Now, just as a rough timeline, it's probably going to be about 15 working days between submitting your documents for the mock DAC and then being able to sit your final DAC. The reason for this is that Rise need to get your documents from you. We need to be allowed some time to provide a review of those, sit the interview with you, and then provide feedback. And then built into those 15 days is that 5 working day requirement from the department where you need to submit your documents 5 days before your final DAC date. And you can agree and book that final DAC directly with the department. So there is a mock DAC available. But just to be clear, if you want to use a mock DAC, which we would possibly encourage you to do, because it is good practice for the final DAC, and it is a really valuable exercise, particularly if you haven't come down this route before, or potentially things have changed if you are moving into local grant delivery from a HUG. So we do recommend a mock DAC. It can be a really, really helpful tool and a really helpful piece of support, but just be aware of the timeline required for that. Avoiding common mistakes. So some of the mistakes we might see is a lack of clear objectives. So we talked about setting the scope before you get to the DAC. So without being clear on what your objectives are, what your goals are in terms of delivery, in terms of contractors, in terms of residents, it's easy for this to become unfocused and for it to feel like maybe you're missing things. Not preparing enough, so not gathering all your information correctly, not completing all the sections of the DAC form, not having a complete fraud document, so missing different sections. Ignoring stakeholders is a common one. As we said, it's really important to talk to people who are involved in the project, allow them a chance to raise issues, allow them to flag things for you before you go through. This will allow you to deal with them before you get to the DAC and show that you have processes in place. Things like superficial assessments, not really engaging properly with different stakeholders, not raising issues or not giving people space to raise issues. Inconsistent communications with your teams, not addressing issues, overlooking any compliance. So, perhaps you need, if you've delivered in HUG, perhaps you need to review whether your contracts are still compliant, whether they're still in contract with you when they're in contract until. Rushing the process, I think, is a big one. We talked a little bit just then about the timelines between the different processes. If there are recommendations that are coming back, we would advise giving yourself some time to understand the recommendations and action them. The purpose of all these reviews is to move your documents closer and closer to the point where they are at an acceptable level and you have a good chance of passing the final DAC with the department and getting into delivery. So rushing the process allows you to miss things and not actioning recommendations that are being provided to you. And then that also feeds into things like a lack of continuous improvement. So not making sure things are ticking over, not being able to continue to review risks or review issues and having processes in place to deal with them. So this can lead to things like missing issues, delays in your program, delays in your DAC being approved, and then therefore delays getting into delivery. It can lead to miscommunication, missing of issues, misunderstandings, or misaligned expectations between teams. The checks can become ineffective. There could be legal and financial consequences, particularly if your fraud management plans haven't been considered or your fraud risk assessment hasn't been updated. Missing details, poor performance, and mistakes throughout. Complying with the requirements of the DAC, there are a number of different benefits. So we are providing clear objectives. Roles and responsibilities of your project team and contractors are clearly defined. Communications between teams is smoothed out. It ensures it's effective and it's efficient. People know what they need to know, and people know what they are doing and what they are responsible for. Collecting information and reporting. If you have your project resource in place, it's been checked, and you have worked to improve allocation to make sure you're meeting the full-time employee requirements, for example, that can all come out of making sure you're fully prepared for the delivery assurance check. You can also think about things like compliance with contractors or staff, risk management, and stakeholder engagement. And just a reminder there that the mock DAC can be a really useful tool of providing you with a kind of trial run before you get to the final DAC. To ensure that you can produce a good delivery assurance check, understand what the requirements are, understand what documents you need to submit, understand what sections of the DAC form you need to complete, and make sure that you putting any recommendations for improvement in place. Make sure you're actioning them. Make sure that your assurance processes are in place. Make sure you can clearly define roles and responsibilities in terms of quality control. So how are you ensuring the performance of your team or of your contractors is good? How can you ensure that they are delivering in the way that you want them to deliver? Ensure all team members are aware of the compliance requirements, make sure they're aware of their roles in the team, and provide training on relevant policy standards or best practices. Make sure that your team are as well prepared as possible to move into delivery. It also allows us to monitor progress and make sure it aligns with requirements, make sure it aligns with your delivery forecast. Pre-check assessments, make sure that everything is in place, identify any issues, identify any possible blockers before you get to the delivery assurance check, because if you can evidence the way in which you're considering blockers and the way in which you're considering issues, trying to mitigate them, that is going to be a real benefit. to you. Again, as we've said, engage with stakeholders, outline your stakeholder engagement strategies, but also engage with internal stakeholders or contractors. We can create checklists, making sure we have written down what we want to talk about, what things we think are strengths in our project. Review your policies and update them. We're thinking about fraud risk here. We're thinking about things like anti-bribery. Maybe you have internal documents or internal guidance around that. Provide the evidence through documents. So all those documents we talked about for the MMR stage are also applicable at the mock DAC and the final DAC. Make sure they're all in order, make sure improvements have been made, make sure you can evidence contracts and you can evidence all these processes. And then by doing all of these things, you can ensure that you are as well prepared as possible for your final delivery assurance check with the department. And the last one from me around this is that the DAC actually is a really helpful tool for your project. It will help you identify issues, it will help you iron them out, and it will give you tips and recommendations to make sure that you are set up to succeed. It ensures your project remains compliant throughout delivery. For those of you who have delivered retrofit programs, it's a real focus as you move into delivery that checks and assurances are in place, that everything's compliant, and that you are delivering as you need to be. And it can be a meaningful process. I think I want to stress that it's not necessarily designed to trip you up. It's just there to double check that you are as ready as possible to start delivering, that everything that needs to be in place is in place. And as a result of that, I'm hoping that all of your projects can deliver as smoothly as possible and you can get the outcomes for your residents and for your organization that you are looking to get. And then finally, just to be aware of the Rise on Demand services, there are lots and lots of resources on the Rise websites. There are recordings of masterclasses, there are toolkits, there are quick guides. There's loads and loads of stuff on there. So if there is anything that you would think you could do with some support or some further information on, please do go to the Rise website and access all of those.
Thank you so much.